Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Assuming that Mike Johnson can get a bill with aid to Ukraine over the finish line, the question then is what comes next? Because before the House went into recess, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene announced that she had filed a motion to vacate the chair. This was the motion that dethroned Speaker Kevin McCarthy, led to nearly a month of wrangling with Republicans trying to find a speaker, failing to find a speaker, and then finally settling on Mike Johnson. And now it looks like she's gearing up for another divisive speaker fight. Let's listen to Speaker Johnson responding to this motion last week on Fox News.
All of my other Republican colleagues recognize this is a distraction from our mission. Again, the mission is to save the Republic. And the only way we can do that is if we grow the House majority, win the Senate, and win the White House. So we don't need any dissension right now. Look, Marjorie Taylor Greene filed the motion. It's not a privileged motion, so it doesn't move automatically. It's just hanging there. And she's frustrated. She and I exchanged text messages even today. We're going to talk early next week. Marjorie's a friend. She's very frustrated about, for example, the last appropriations bills. Guess what? So am I. As we discussed, Trey, these are not the perfect pieces of legislation that you and I and Marjorie would draft if we had the ability to do it differently. But with the smallest margin in U.S. history, we're sometimes going to get legislation that we don't like.
To underline the point about the narrowness of Speaker Johnson's margin at the moment, Republicans have a 2-seat advantage in the House. It's 218 to 213 Democrats. But Congressman Mike Gallagher is about to leave the House, so that would bring it down to a 1-seat majority. And Kate, I still am not sure if this is a real threat by Marjorie Taylor Greene or if she is just trying to make some more headlines. And it is notable that, as Speaker Johnson said, as far as I can tell, no other Republican has publicly signed up for this yet.
Yes, and I would suggest it being a threat and a stunt is not mutually exclusive. And to some extent, it's probably both. I do think that the dynamics are fundamentally different than they were when Republicans defenestrated Kevin McCarthy, and that those favor Mike Johnson, and that he is very hard to portray in the same way McCarthy was derided, that he doesn't have members who have personal grievances against him the way that Matt Gaetz did against Kevin McCarthy, for instance. And it also, Republicans, I think some of them at least, may have learned something from the several weeks of chaos that followed having no speaker, the struggle to come up with one, and maybe are less enthused about the idea of doing that here in April as they cruise towards a November election. So you have a lot of options, ways that it could go, but my own modest prediction is that the motion doesn't move even if the Ukraine money passes. And that's because I think there are enough Republicans who understand that even if they're not happy with some of the ways the war in Ukraine has gone or what Biden has done, cutting off Ukraine and owning the consequences is not what they want. And also that they will not benefit in November from another 4 weeks of circular firing squad, and that Mike Johnson is simply hard to portray as a rhino sellout only weeks after you've promoted him from being a conservative backbencher to Speaker of the House. So all of that, I think right now, things could change, but I think right now it favors that motion failing. My last word on this would be that if Mike Johnson simply does whatever Marjorie Greene wants and doesn't do anything to offend her, then she's effectively the Speaker of the House. And I think, if anything, Johnson will command even more respect from his members by deciding that some projects the House needs to do, that he needs to govern, that he's obliged to govern, and that he will own the consequences if he doesn't pass the Ukraine bill. So again, I think it's a show of leadership on his part, and he deserves credit for it, and that ultimately conferences and voters tend to reward that quality.
Kim, what's your read of the dynamics here? One other thing that I would add is that Marjorie Taylor Greene is not backing down. On Tuesday, she released a Dear Colleague letter to the Republican conference, doubling down, or maybe I should say quintupling down. It's several pages long. Here is one of the most heated portions of it. She writes, Mike Johnson worked with Chuck Schumer rather than with us and gave Joe Biden and the Democrats everything they wanted, no different from how a Speaker Hakeem Jeffries would have done. Speaker Johnson fully funded special counsel Jack Smith's witch hunt and 91 indictments against President Trump, our Republican presidential nominee. If convicted, this would be a death sentence for President Trump. A death sentence for President Trump is precisely what the Democrats want. And Kim, as is often the case with this faction of the party, what I don't see here is any real plan that would make any real difference. If House Republicans tried to pass some kind of budget that defunded special counsel Jack Smith, that would go to President Biden's desk and would be promptly vetoed. And it actually wouldn't even get there because it wouldn't get through Chuck Schumer's Senate. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is there is all sorts of anger in the Republican conference, including from Marjorie Taylor Greene, but it's not limited to her. And what is lacking is any sort of sketch of how to get from point A, where they are, to point Z, where they want to be in a divided government where they only control one chamber of the House by 2 votes.
I read that entire letter that Marjorie Taylor Greene sent out. And the thing that struck me about it is how easily it could have been a list of particulars, not describing Speaker Johnson, but describing the fractious wing of the party that she ascribes to, which is very much to blame for some of the complaints that she has in there. I mean, for instance, she spent pages in the article describing her complaints about the recent funding bill that went through. By the way, I know that nobody was particularly happy with it. $1.2 trillion that did the major pieces of the government at the very end. And she had a bunch of complaints that, well, up until Kevin McCarthy was dethroned, we had passed 7 appropriations bills. There were 5 to go, but Mike Johnson didn't make those happen. Well, why didn't those happen? The reason they didn't happen, and they didn't go to the Senate, and that there weren't conferences with the Senate, and that this didn't happen in a regular order kind of way, which is what she wants, is that large factions of the Republican Party on the right said, if we can't have everything we want in these bills, including a whole lot of those extreme policy writers, well, I should say extreme to Democrats, those policy writers, which Joe Biden would have vetoed without blinking an eye, then we're not going to go through with this process. Okay, well, that's what ends up happening. And to sort of go back and suggest that this is now all on Mike Johnson because he can't suddenly magically make all the children get along with each other is just remarkable. And I think that's why people have not signed on to this letter. They understand the dysfunction that is going on. I do worry about this letter, though, in this regard. I think it was planned very carefully. I think she hinted at her warning before they went on break. She let that bubble and brew. And then she dropped this letter when she came back. And the key element of that letter was essentially a threat saying, if you really want to make everybody angry, go ahead and move on that Ukraine bill. So this letter was very carefully designed to try to put pressure on Johnson to back away from that. I totally agree with Kate that would be detrimental to him and to the caucus. So she's getting a lot of attention, but hopefully the Republican Party has the ability in the House to see through the theatrics and focus on the prize.
Thank you, Kim and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.